Okay, I think it's time to get going, given we have an hour and a jam-packed schedule. So first, I'd like to welcome everyone to Sierra Camp's second public workshop for this year. My name is James Sedlak, Civic Spark Fellow for Sierra Business Council, alongside colleagues Justine Quealy and Jill Stamberg in the background. As a former forestry technician who has worked on wildfires, I feel very fortunate to facilitate today's discussion. For anyone new, Sierra Camp stands for Sierra Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Partnership, an effort managed by SBC, which connects organizations, businesses, and local governments to activate regional adaptation and mitigation strategies. For more information about membership, you can click the link in the chat box. In light of the heightened threat of wildfire, we all know all too well, today's workshop features a panel discussion on forest management and considerations for wildfire preparedness. Our panelists have kindly given us their time today, and we hope you all find it informative. If you have any questions during the discussion, please add them in the question and answer box, and we'll do our best to answer them in the last 20 minutes of the hour. You can also upvote questions in the queue or raise your hand to be unmuted and ask your question live. So now I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists, and I will pass it over first to Kerri Timmer.
Hey, good morning, everyone, or I guess afternoon, actually. My name is Kerri Timmer. I'm the Regional Forest Health Coordinator for Placer County. This is a new position that the County Board of Supervisors created a year ago in recognition of the importance of forest health and wildfire safety, and very glad to be here this morning. Thanks.
And next, Janet.
Hi there, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janet Hatfield. I am the Forest Health Program Manager for the Whitebark Institute, and I've been working to launch a project in the Mammoth Lakes area called the Eastern Sierra Climate and Communities Resilience Project.
And Taro.
Hi, good day. Taro Pusina from Wrightwood, California, on a wildfire incident right now, but I'm with a Spatial Informatics Group as a wildfire and fuels consultant, and I've got about a 30-year federal fire career as a forest fire chief and mechanical hazard fuel reduction, prescribed fire, aggressive suppression, and management of fires for multiple objectives, including protection and resource benefit. Happy to be part of this meeting.
Great, and last but not least, Kyle.
Good afternoon, Kyle Jacobson. I'm the Deputy Fire Chief for the U.S. Forest Service on the Lake Tahoe Basin. Been in fire and fuels for about 20 years, lots of planning in the wildland urban interface. I am also a qualified FBAN and an operations section chief on one of the California Type 1 teams. Thanks for having me.
Great. So now I'm going to, as you probably have seen, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can get the panelists up and running spotlight so we can all see everyone as we start our discussion. Just give us one moment here. Great. So I think we're all set. I think it would be helpful maybe to start with some background information. I'm wondering if one of you can just give us a brief overview of fuel treatments and their intended purpose. Perhaps, Janet, can I pass that to you?
Sure, thanks. So yeah, I guess fuels treatments, very simply defined, are can be a wide variety of suite of treatments, from hand or mechanical thinning to prescribed fire, and they're intended to reduce, quite simply, the amount of fuel or woody biomass on both the forest floor, often to include breaks in the canopy, and typically also address ladder fuels, which are more intermediate fuels, small to intermediate trees that help facilitate fire movement from the surface fuels into the canopy, which is something we try to avoid. And the intended result from this work is really a reduction in fire intensity so that emergency services operational personnel have some tactical options when trying to protect communities.
Thank you so much. And maybe I could pass it over to someone who can speak to those advantages and those successes. Perhaps Kyle, I believe you can speak to a prime example that we probably know well right here in the Basin with the Caldor fire.
Yeah, so here on the Caldor fire, it was a tremendous success, all of the fuels treatments in the wildland urban interface. There was enough time for the fire to transition from a crown fire, drop down to surface fire conditions, which allowed our firefighters and our ground personnel to engage in the fire. Initially, the treatments that we had in the Myers area were just a very thin strip, and there wouldn't have been enough transition time to move that fire out of the crowns. But luckily, we had gone back in, we had expanded those treatments to a larger area, and you can clearly see where the fire transitioned out, allowed our firefighters and equipment to get in, attack a surface fire, establish an anchor, and continue pushing that fire uphill away from the structures and the infrastructure that we had here kind of everywhere on the Caldor. Another key component that I think we're going to talk about later is the treatments were completed on all lands. This wasn't just Forest Service lands that were treated. We worked very closely through the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team with a lot of different partners and collaborators to make sure state, federal, and private lands were all treated, creating a continuous fuel treatment throughout the area, and that was really beneficial. And fires are very dynamic and can always change, and you never know what's going to happen and where the fire is going to go. So making sure that that treatment occurs on all lands is something that's super beneficial.
I'm curious too if any of you have experience with fuel treatments that perhaps have failed their intended purpose.
I've got a few, but I'll let Taro jump in and see if he's got one he wants to start with.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to tack on to a little bit of what you and Janet said. You know, prior to 100 years of aggressive fire suppression, many of the communities and the lands in and around them burned very frequently under mostly low to moderate intensity with lightning caused fires. So we've disrupted that process, and now there's far more vegetation, live and dead, in all different size classes. And every day the sun comes out, it continues to accumulate. So we're trying to reduce fuels to create resiliency in our forests to wildfire and to try to get them back to a state that they're more healthy. We're trying to restore health, which also restores resilience to catastrophic wildfire. Mechanical treatments are only a partial surrogate compared to actual fire, whether it's prescribed or natural lightning or human-caused fires. But to your question about successes and failures, and I think a number of us on this call can cite both. For failures, it's important to point out that there are no guarantees with fuel treatments, only efforts, once again, to restore resilience and forest health, but also to reduce the likelihood of the impacts of catastrophic wildfires and increase the likelihood of success that firefighters will be able to engage these fires and protect all of these values that we hold so near and dear. Of course, there's communities, life, property, but all the myriad of other values that we care so much about that can easily be wiped out by one wildfire. But there are certainly no guarantees. And the failures, in spite of our best efforts, we can conduct massive fuels treatments, but during a hot, dry, wind-driven wildfire that is exhibiting sustained crown fire runs, you're going to get ember cast that's going to go out in front of the main fire, sometimes miles in front of the main fire front. And there just simply aren't enough firefighting and fire responding resources to chase down every single one of those embers or to post up at every single one of your homes in the wildland interface. But once again, we're doing our best to increase our likelihood of success.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that real quick, most of these treatments are designed for around 90th percentile conditions. A lot of our more recent fires have been burning over 100th percentile conditions. We're establishing new records daily. Dixie Fire, North Fire, even the Caldor Fire, the conditions are very extreme that the firefighters are fighting in. And when you have these massive crown runs and these treatments are designed to moderate fire behavior, they might moderate it, but from something that's super crazy extreme to something that's extreme. So it's still an extreme fire event that's occurring. And there are several examples. And a lot of times it is the size and the scale of those treatments and really how long is that fire burning through a treatment. Because some of these days when you're getting 20,000 acre runs, and you have a 100-acre treatment in front of it, that's not really going to be effective in changing that fire behavior. So just the conditions we're seeing versus what these treatments were really designed for, and taking into consideration what are we trying to do with these treatments, and maybe we need to go a little bit further sometimes if we're really trying to protect WUI and infrastructure.
You know, Kyle pointed out the Dixie Fire. That was a fire where we saw long range spots that subsequently burned an entire community down that had significant amount of fuels treatment around it. So once again, no guarantee, but a couple of successes a little bit closer to home. I'm sure Kyle can speak to, and others, successes on the Calder and parts of the Calder, perhaps unsuccessful, lower country, more dense, continuous vegetation. Couple of successes real quick in the Sierra foothills, two of Sierra Nevada's largest wildfires in history, the Rim and the Rough Fire, had significant successes from treatments done by multiple agencies, including Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and CAL FIRE, where those fires ran into the treatments, fire behavior in some cases essentially dropped down from the canopies of the trees from crown fire to a surface fire, which allows us to engage them to protect communities. And so a number of successes on those that are worth mentioning.
That's great. Thank you all so much for that. I'm curious with projects that have been executed in the past. We've seen how they've either helped or hurt, or not necessarily hurt, but didn't do a whole lot. I'm wondering what we're doing now in the Sierra that maybe our listeners can benefit hearing about. And so I'd love to maybe pass it over to you, Kerri, if you could talk about your French Meadows restoration project and maybe some of the best practices going on with that.
Sure, thanks, James. So yeah, the French Meadows project is in the upper Middle Fork American watershed. It's on land that is owned and managed by the Tahoe National Forest, but there is intermixed with private properties also managed by the American River Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy. So after the King Fire in 2014, which occurred in a neighboring watershed, the Rubicon, that fire was burned at extremely high severity fire, and then there were winter storms the year after that sent just tons of sediment and pollutants into one of the two major water distribution areas for Placer County and the Placer County Water Agency. And so as a result of PCWA, the water agencies and the county's experience with having to spend tens of millions of dollars in cleanup there to bring sediment out of the reservoir and to clean up the pollutants that were affecting the water quality. And this is water and energy that support communities, roughly 250,000 people downstream. So it's kind of a big deal, in addition to all the other benefits that, of course, were burned up in that high severity fire. So seeing that happen created the French Meadows partnership, because the French Meadows Reservoir is the second reservoir that feeds into the same water and energy hydro project. So a partnership came together of the Forest Service, the county, the water agency, the American River Conservancy under this kind of all lands approach that we've been talking about. Also, I said Nature Conservancy, Sierra Nevada Conservancy as a state agency that is interested in this area as well, and UC Merced, which was kind of an interesting addition to our project. They were They wanted to look at the different types of treatments that we've been talking about, mechanical and prescribed burning, to determine what impact, if any, those treatments have on water quality and particularly water supply. So they're doing this kind of hydrologic study in hand with the actual treatment on the ground that we're doing for French Meadows. So this partnership came together under a master stewardship agreement with the Tahoe National Forest, which authorized Placer County to manage the work on the ground. And this is what I think gets us into some of the best practices that I hope other parts of the Sierra could take advantage of. And that is really looking at the different entities and agencies that have an interest in the geographic area that you're talking about, and have different skill sets and different levels of flexibility, shall we say, where the county can be more flexible than the federal government or even the state government, and then the nonprofit partners even more flexible maybe than the county. And that way you take advantage of really the best that each partner can offer. So in our case, the county is really serving as the project manager. We're handling all the contracting, the procurement, the vendors that are doing the work on the ground. We manage the registered professional forester, who's the one out there every day working with the vendors on the ground. We're also the one leading the charge on fund development, because no single agency has all the money that's required to do this work. So by partnering, we can each bring in various funding sources and funding opportunities. So I think that's probably the biggest lesson learned out of this project, is just the benefit of that all-ends approach, and therefore the different types of partners that come together to accomplish the work. There's been a lot of challenges, which I think we'll probably get into a little bit later, that best practices are also growing out of those challenges. But I think we were able to vastly accelerate the ability to start work on the ground because of the different elements that we were able to bring to the permitting process and whatnot. So just everything, we were doing things in parallel instead of linearly, and I think that allowed us to move much quicker.
Thank you. And I'd like to pass a similar question over to you, Janet, and if you can tie in an overview of the Eastern Sierra Climate and Communities Resilience Project.
Sure. So I guess I would start with, we call it the donut locally, just because the name is so long. So you have to have a grown-up name for a grant application, but locally we call it the donut because it started really conceptually as a 5-mile radius around the town of Mammoth Lakes. And then that boundary has been refined pretty significantly to be a little bit more meaningful than that, but it's still quite large. It's a 56,000 acre project. So it encompasses much of the Upper Owens River watershed, which is a primary drinking water source for the city of Los Angeles. We supply about 33% of the municipal water down there. In addition to the community wildfire protection component of that project, I got a lot of early questions about why is it so big? And yes, we could protect the community with a smaller project, but we recognize that all of the other ecosystem service benefits in that landscape were absolutely critical to also protecting. So water quality, water supply, obviously, and a really significant component in our neck of the woods is the recreation economy that really drives the whole region where we live. And so a catastrophic or a high severity fire across a significant portion of this landscape could really be damaging to the local economies as well, not to mention wildlife habitat, etc. So we're in the early phases of the project. So we're kind of just completed sort of the pre-planning. We've developed the proposed action and we're entering into the NEPA process right now. The majority of the land is federally owned. It's the nature of the Eastern Sierra. We just don't have a lot of private land. So the land jurisdiction is not something I can give a lot of advice on. And that's nice because it's nice to have one thing that's a little simpler in a project of this big. But one thing that's different in our area is we have not had yet, knock on wood, a close call that is really driving the momentum that you're seeing at French Meadows, like Kerri mentioned, and Kyle at the Caldor area. The Angora fire in 2008 really got the momentum behind that Tahoe Fire and Fuels team to get all that work done. And so that's something that is a struggle here because we haven't had that really close call that a lot of the folks that are ahead of us, sort of forging the way, have to motivate people. So that's something that I spend a lot of time trying to do in hopes that we don't have to learn the hard lesson. So I would just echo Kerri's comments about the partners that you bring in. They all have a wide variety of things that they can bring to the table. We modeled our efforts similarly to French Meadows, talking with them early in the project to really focus on key beneficiaries who will stand to gain the most or lose the most if we don't get this work done. And what can they bring to the table? And I guess what has been one of the overarching thing that I think has led to some of our early success is just thinking big enough. Thinking for that worst case scenario, what the conditions are going to be like 20 to 50 years from now. And recognizing that, yeah, we'll start right close to the community, and that's going to take the first 5+ years of time just to get the community safe. But I think the scale of the work has been a huge magnet for attracting funding coming from the state. It's certainly what the state is pushing for and wants to see.
And I'm curious, when you bring all of these players together, all these stakeholders, what are some ways that you think, and I like this question because we have some folks that specialize a little bit more in the field and operations and more on the planning side and kind of project coordination. What are some of the ways that field ops and community planners can best work together to kind of like create that shared vision?
I'd say in my experience, it's communications, just frequent and detailed, especially as, I sit in an office in Auburn. I'm not a forester, but our registered professional forester who's up in the field, which is, roughly a 2.5-hour drive from here, because this is a very remote project. I didn't really describe the project itself. We've got 6,000 acres of planned mechanical treatment and a separate 6,000 acres worth of planned prescribed burning if the windows ever open again. And this is across roughly a 22,000 acre footprint area. So it's pretty remote. It's up outside of Forest Hill. And a lot can happen out in the field with the individual vendors in terms of are they meeting their equipment standards? The Forest Service is out there all the time, of course, paying attention to that. Are they following the treatment plan? Are they, there's a lot of detail in the day-to-day work that we need to keep track of so that everybody is comfortable enough, to maintain that partnership, because as one part of the partnership maybe strays a little bit, that frays at the fabric, if you will, and that starts creating, concerns or a little bit of a lack of trust or questions, and you want to avoid that. So, what I've learned in this 1 year of managing this project is the more communication, the better. And that's communication both with the field operations and then also with the Forest Service as our primary partner and land manager, weekly check-in calls with them, both the field staff as one call, but also the district ranger, just so that everybody knows what's going on, everybody knows who's in the field, what work is being scheduled for the week, and just kind of building that and increasing that comfort level so that people are willing to kind of let this stuff happen outside of their control.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe switch gears since we have, such, I guess, a great experience here around wildfire planning. I'd love to, be able to give our attendees just a snapshot into each of your kind of experiences around the lessons learned throughout your work. I think planners and folks on the call can perhaps really benefit from that. Maybe starting off with the idea of how we view risk management moving forward and what that might, or how that might play into planning and collaboration. And that's open to anyone.
I could take a stab and to tack on to some of Kerri's comments. Communication and collaboration amongst cooperators, whether they're state, federal, local government, private, and any number of other stakeholders, but also understanding the limitations of the landowners and their ability to physically implement, whether it's mechanical or prescribed fire treatments. But to your question about lessons learned, for me, if we're truly going to restore resilience to our landscapes around our communities and other values, there has to be a leveling of the risk playing field and an incentivizing taking the risk to conduct prescribed fire treatments. Mechanical treatments alone are not the solution. They're a partial surrogate to lots of frequent natural fire. These forests and forest systems need fire to persist and survive, and that means fire back on the landscape. So a lot of it comes down to educating. People need to come to terms with the fact that wildfire is always been here and will always be here. So how do you come to terms with that fire and smoke? How do you want that fire and smoke? And so I would propose that we try to manage as much fire on the landscape when conditions and science tells us it's favorable to do so. And a lot of that comes down to education. You can't just keep putting out every single fire. So leveling and incentivizing, taking the risks, putting prescribed fire and unplanned wildfires on the same playing field. So mobilizing, this would require policy change, but this is where folks in the room can help implement real change into the future. Let's use incident management teams like those that Kyle and I are on to do proactive treatments instead of reactive response to wildfires. Some of the limitations that these agencies have are they don't have enough people to do these treatments, to take the risk to conduct the prescribed burning. We do have people to respond to wildfires, and we're good at that. So let's use some of that horsepower, some of that federal funding to proactively do the kinds of treatments we need to do, to use science to help us decide which fires and where we can actually manage for benefits and protection and suppression objectives instead of always just reacting and taking whatever we're getting out of the catastrophic wildfire. We have these large wildfires. We know that these large wildfires didn't all burn with high severity. They weren't all, or parts of the fires weren't all destructive. There were parts of these fires that burned with low to moderate intensity. And in a lot of these areas, now the clock has been reset around these communities and values that we care about. We need to acknowledge that and acknowledge fire's role in the landscape and its ability to restore these landscapes in and around our communities. Instead of nod, nod, wink, wink, we're going to suffer through the benefits of this wildfire. I know that was a lot, but yeah, happy to go more in depth on any of that.
And I think there's opportunities at the other end of the spectrum. I can say that we're just starting our 2022 work season, so I'm kind of mired in the details of being in the field. And there are things that can be done in the field too. So for example, we consulted with the Forest Service, with Tahoe National Forest, and they about some of the kind of vendor risk. I mean, there's risk on the vendors too, where they come in and agree to do work, but then if we are restricted from doing that work because of extreme weather or nearby fire conditions, then they've got crews and equipment out there that they're not earning money on, and they still have to pay them. So that has been a big concern. So we've done a few things to try to address that. One is consulting with the Forest Service and working with them to somewhat modify their process for allowing variances that would allow work to continue on days that otherwise might be restricted. So they made that process a little bit easier. So that's just a streamlining kind of aspect that they were willing to do. And then the vendors themselves, we held a kickoff meeting at the beginning of the season, and the vendors themselves have talked about how can they pool their resources. They're all out there, in the same general location together at the same time doing their different pieces of work. How can they pool their resources and make sure that maybe there's an additional water tender out there, or they've got, maybe they collectively fund a couple of individuals who can be monitoring at the end of the day to be sure that their work did not spark something that might kick up overnight. And so, trying to deal with the potential for operational ignition, which is the last thing, of course, we want to have happen. But there are things like that. There's also we extended all of our vendor contracts out another couple of years to give them the confidence that we're going to keep this project going, even if we're not able to complete as many acres of treatment per year as we anticipated. So, and we're trying to do the same thing with our funding sources, is trying to make sure that we have the maximum amount of time available to spend the dollars, so that we don't have to waste so much time with amendments and trying to make the case for why we can't finish the work in the originally prescribed time frame. So that, there's a lot of just that sort of functional detail that can lend a little bit of comfort, confidence, and assurance to the people that you're working with on the project, that all of the resources will be there for the duration.
Wondering if any of you have specific or more insight into this idea of educating the community and maybe getting this the social buy-in for change, where, like Janet, you had mentioned, you're not waiting for something to happen to act, to change things. You're what does it take, minus an event like that, to get people on board?
A real good question. I might be able to have an answer for you in about 5 years, but that's a huge deal in ours. Our project is incredibly high visibility. We get a ton of recreation visitors, like, a huge surges, 30,000 people come, similar to the Basin, for different events and whatever on weekends, etc. So there's no hiding this work, and it is very different. And I think a thing that we struggle with as Californians is most people who live in the West don't know what a healthy and functioning forest needs to look like. We're so used to the dysfunction that's all around us that's a huge lift. And I'm often asked, what do you think the most challenging thing of your project is? And there are a lot of challenges, let me just say. And I do kind of always go back to the need to educate the public accordingly, because it takes one squeaky wheel to really put the brakes on a project like this. So we've invested in a position that will basically take the brunt of that work to develop material for targeted audiences so that it's relevant to them. We're really focusing on the youth, recognizing we're not going to change some people's opinions. But if in 10 or 20 years from now, we're still having the same conversation about improving public understanding, we missed the boat big time. And it's too bad we didn't start that 20 or 30 years ago when the science was pointing that way. So that's a big emphasis that we're trying to do here. But and then the last one is that we get all partners to help us spread that word with really consistent messaging, so that they're not being confused, because there's a lot coming out in the media about questioning the effectiveness and the viability of this type of work, and that needs to stop, or we're going to be in a world of hurt.
Yeah, I don't think you can outreach and educate enough. And when you're planning these kinds of projects, the more town hall meetings you can get, county boards of supervisors, folks at all different levels, stakeholders. I mean, most people get and understand that, their communities are at great risk to catastrophic wildfire. And so once again, once you come to terms with that, and or your light bulb goes off that, hey, if I don't get in front of this thing, there's a pretty high likelihood I'm going to lose not only my town, but everything in and around it, then you can start getting people's buy-in. I mean, I've spent my whole career trying to convince people they need to tolerate less fuel and vegetation in their backyard that abuts federal land, that they need to tolerate chainsaws running and, more spacing between the trees, less logs on the forest floor. Yes, it's not as nice for your aesthetic if you like very dense forests and you don't want to see your neighbors, but at the same time, all of that increases the likelihood for your community, having a bad outcome. And so once the light bulb goes off for people, they're going to start getting behind it. Most folks are smart enough to understand that if they don't, the consequences are much more dire. You're simply passing the buck, pushing the ball down the road for a future generation to have to deal with. And that's what we're dealing with now. We're paying the piper. We're paying back a debt that's long overdue with a lot of interest right now. How long do you want to keep pushing that down the road? Or do you want to get in front of these treatments, in front of these wildfires with very proactive and progressive treatments? And so coming to terms with that, with less trees, less vegetation, chainsaws in your backyards, piles burning in and around your communities, burn piles. And I'll even say it, broadcast prescribed burning in your backyards so that when that wildfire comes, we can make a stand and use those treatments to then protect your community. And so educating the public of that, it's the hard truth, it's the hard pill to swallow. But look, we've decided to live in these WUI communities, so we need to roll up our sleeves and get to work.
Yeah, I'm just gonna hit on, I think, what Taro and Janet said as well, because that's what we've seen here is we really need to shift the culture and what people believe and used to view as a forest and what their backyard is supposed to look like to what it needs to look like and what it used to look like. And Janet really hit on a lot of that. And that's an all lands, all hands approach. We really need to all come together, consistent messaging. One thing we've been successful here in the Lake Tahoe Basin is we have a group dedicated to public information that's made up of federal, state, local government, parks, multi-states, and getting that consistent messaging, bringing in scientists, bringing in land managers, bringing in fire managers, bringing in a bunch of different perspectives, bringing them all to the same table and having that messaging go out to the public that is all consistent. So they're hearing that message from multiple sources to be able to change perspectives, because you get a lot of, well, I read this article that said that, who better to answer that than a scientist that wrote one of those articles? Or, when this fire occurred, this is what happened. No, I was actually on that fire and this is what happened. Or I heard they're planning to do this. Well, no, I'm in charge of that planning project and this is what we're planning on doing, to make sure that we're all on the same page moving forward and really providing that messaging to the public that we're all on board together, despite what our different missions may be, to make this successful for our communities.
And I think too, for those of us who actually have some work under our belts on these kinds of projects, we're like roughly halfway through, probably after 3 field seasons, heading into our 4th, is field tours. I mean, there's nothing better than to dispel the horror, the horrible picture people might have in their minds about what does a prescribed burn look like after it's done, or what does mechanical thinning look like and mastication on the ground? Is it just a big mess and are all the trees blackened, and what does it look like? To go out and see, you go, oh wow, okay, I could live with that. I can live in that. That is not nearly as bad as I was envisioning in my head, the worst case scenario. And it's certainly all better than what the poor people are looking at now for decades and lifetimes to come when you get a major fire that comes through. So, anything that I throw it out there, anything that I can do to, to help make available our work for field tours, we are more than happy to do that.
I see a question just came in. I'm going to read it slowly out loud, and anyone can jump on it. I'm hoping someone can speak about the need to keep some wildlife habitat around homes, neighborhoods, and surrounding forests, snags, logs, shrubs, etc., with fire safety. How have people been balancing wildlife needs and community fire safety?
I guess I'll take a stab, I guess, at that. And we did in our project, we did obviously a prioritization planning effort. It's 3 tiers. One starts with the built environment, but the second recognizes what the local priorities are, and those in our area rose to the top were recreation and wildlife habitat. And fortunately, it turns out that wildlife really seems to like what the scientists called heterogeneity, which is basically a lot of different looking types of forests, which is good because that's actually what a healthy forest also looks like. And it's also a heck of a lot easier to slow down a fire when it's not just the continuous carpet of trees. So they kind of go hand in hand. There's a lot of good literature out there. And one of, when you're talking about at least species of conservation concern, I know a lot of the reports and the conservation strategies that are out there speak to large scale, high severity wildfire being one of the predominant risks to species habitat. So again, we're not in a perfect scenario. I wish we didn't have to go in and do these intensive treatments now, but at the end of the day, we're really trying to adopt what the new science points to are these, what the scientists call ICO patterns across the landscape, which is a fancy acronym or a simple acronym maybe for what that heterogeneity across the landscape looks like, where small portions of more dense trees are absolutely okay, so long as there are openings next to those areas that provide that good edge habitat and all of the other types of ecosystem service benefits that wildlife really needs. So that's how we've sort of addressed it here on our project.
I think Janet's right on there. And if we use science to help guide our treatments, science tells us that wildlife adapted to frequent low intensity wildfire forever before we started excluding fire from the landscape. Wildlife in general is resilient. And yes, these huge wildfires are incredibly destructive and detrimental to wildlife. But if we look at historic sizes of fires and how they occurred naturally and somewhat try to mimic that, the science will tell you that, as Janet points out, they thrive on edges, on a variety of different species and canopy heights and densities. And it's that heterogeneity that will help wildlife. Yes, there will always be some impact to wildlife, but how did they do it before we came in and started meddling, right? I mean, they're going to adapt. Spotted owls have sadly adapted to overly dense forests, coming from forests that were more open. I'm pretty sure they could adapt to more open forests again. If we choose to manage fire at the right time of the year when conditions aren't as severe, many species of wildlife, mammals, are able to get out of the way of wildfire. Catastrophic, fast-moving crown fire for thousands and thousands of acres, no, they're gonna get hit hard. So
we have another question that came in that I think is interesting because it relates to this idea of how we manage risk. Have any of you had success with support and interest from home insurance companies who stand to lose a lot of money from fires?
They're fleeing California. I don't know that, actually, I'm being a little bit glib there. I know that as much as I hate this situation, the California Fair Plan, which is the insurer of last resort, if your homeowner's insurance has canceled at least the fire component of your insurance policy, the insurance commissioner has heard, especially coming from the rural communities, I think this need for some better solution than having to pay 4 or 5 times what you used to pay for insurance to cover the fire risk. So I think that the Fair Plan, as again, that insurer of last resort, is looking at ways to kind of credit homeowners who have taken responsibility for home hardening activities or, defensible space activities and things like that. So there's actually, they're building, as I understand it, some sort of a credit system that will reduce the amount that a homeowner has to pay if they have met some of these home hardening criteria, which I think may also respond to a bit to one of the other questions of what can the architects and others do around this fire situation beyond just code enforcement. And I think it's that, design with home hardening and community hardening aspects in mind.
Can also talk about here in Lake Tahoe Basin, there's a group. It was actually started by some of the local fire chiefs working closely with some of the insurance companies and how they are, evaluating homes and their wildfire risk. And they're looking at areas where fuel treatments have taken place and potentially changing that evaluation process for those structures immediately adjacent and somewhat protected by those fuels treatments, rather than just declaring a large area at high risk, really looking at the work that's been done around those particular communities or structures, and possibly changing insurance rates or how they look at judging those homes and those buildings, so that there could actually be a larger benefit than, just the wildlife and protecting your home, but you could actually see a reduction in rates or increased accessibility to insurance as they look through some of these processes. It's still in the early stages, but something to keep eyes on as it moves forward.
And I think there's an opportunity for two-way education here too. I mean, these insurance companies are used to primarily insuring more urban and densely populated areas, and so their criteria reflect that. So, for example, I live downhill from an open irrigation ditch, in a WUI area in the Gold Country. Why do I not get some credit for that? Similarly to someone who gets credit for living within that same distance from a fire hydrant. So trying to educate these insurance companies about the distinctions between, but also the benefits, but the differences between rural and more urbanized communities might lead them to evaluate slightly differently.
We've had a little interest for sure on the insurance front, mostly from the Nature Conservancy, who's leading some research right now that started with French Meadows on the wildfire resilience insurance piece, which they're trying to pilot, I guess, at North Star at Tahoe into the marketplace. So I think it'll be good to keep an eye on the outcome of that pilot study to see if we can actually get that mechanism in place, which turns out to also be a helpful financing tool for some of this work. And I know in early conversations with Blue Forest Conservation, they're working within their forest resilience bond structure to bring in insurance companies to help aggregate some additional financial support to help pay for the work, recognizing, they're likely going to pay far less with that proactive investment than they are if it goes the other way. So I think there's a lot of hope for the future yet, but I think a lot of the work is quite early still. And there's a bit of a chicken and the egg thing, because you don't realize the benefit until the work is done. And so getting that ironed out so that we can get the work done and realize those benefits is really what we're all charged with now.
I'd like to just read one of the other questions, I think, Kerri, you had touched on it, but I just want to see if anyone else has a response to it. What sort of opportunities are there in the area of building professionals, i.e. architects, engineers, developers, et cetera, to support wildfire interface beyond code compliance?
Well, you can think about, one thing to think about is just assume that there won't be any fire responding entities when the wildfire comes through your community. What would you like your property, your landscaping, your house to be made of? What can you do to make your house and your property more attractive when there are only 15 engines, but 100 houses that they're trying to protect? So, the WUI codes that have been in place since 2008, that's a start. There's lots of kinds of materials you can use that are more resilient. You could build concrete bunkers, I suppose, but not very attractive. But I just like to think about it in terms of what can you do to design your house and the lands in and around your house, assuming there's going to be nobody there when the fire comes through, or a very limited number of resources. Why would I want to choose to put an engine at your house versus your neighbor's house? I know that doesn't exactly answer the question, but that's kind of how I think about it from an operational standpoint.
I might add that the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network has a huge ton of resources about what really that word means. And it has a really great graphic if you go to their website around all the different players that are going to be needed to be at the table to really achieve resilience. So, you know, most of us are working in the space outside on the wildlands. There's very little work I can do inside the community at a parcel level other than educate. And I think the Fire Adapted Communities folks have a great sort of graphic wheel that say, you know, here's all the different pieces and parts, starting with the general plan, code requirements, et cetera, and all the way through the realtors now who have to disclose what the wildfire risk is when you're purchasing a piece of property. So if we can get all of those different parties informed with good educational material, it might take some time for the actual compliance requirements to come through, but at least a good start. And that website's a great resource.
Great. Thank you so much for that mention. I just dropped that link into the chat box in case anyone wants to explore that. And we have another question about collaboration. How are air quality agencies being engaged, since typically this is the agency that gets public smoke complaints?
I can take a shot at that, having tried to put lots of smoke in the air, the right kind of smoke at the right time of year when dispersion is favorable. You've got the Federal Clean Air Act, which says it's against the law to do anything that's going to harm the public. You've got Title 17 in California that essentially treats any prescribed fire or any lightning caused fires that are managed for resource benefit objectives as a prescribed fire and regulated as such. And then you've got various air boards throughout the state with different levels of funding and science to help them make their decisions. But I'll say that the more progressive air boards, the state of California's California Air Resources Board, some of the larger districts like San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution understand, once again, that they're going to get wildfire and smoke or prescribed fire and smoke. And so when and how do you want that smoke? Well, you want it when the conditions are favorable for dispersion, when meteorology is in alignment. And we're looking at reinterpreting some of these laws like California's Title 17. And the more progressive air boards like San Joaquin are asking the federal agencies and the implementers why they're not putting more fire and smoke on the ground when you have favorable dispersions. Let's match emissions with dispersal. So in other words, when we're having favorable dispersion, let's try to put as much smoke in the air as possible so we limit the impacts to our communities. When we're under strong high pressure and we have a high likelihood of adversely impacting communities in smoke sensitive areas, let's try not to put as much smoke in the air. And so a reinterpretation of federal and state laws is happening. It's happening at the local level with implementers working directly with their local county air boards. And that's what it's going to take from the local level all the way up to the national level to reinterpret some of these laws, which I would argue are a bit antiquated now.
Well, and I think there's some policy issues that are being ignored currently for whatever reason, at least at the state level, that we need to, you know, as citizen advocates, we need to hammer on, and that is black carbon. So, I mean, black carbon is one of it's very intense and it's much more impactful than the greenhouse gas emissions, but it's short-lived. So it's, you know, it's brief, but really dangerous. And there's no policy around that in terms, and wildfire is the main cause of black carbon, or the main producer of black carbon in the atmosphere. So, I mean, until we're realistically addressing all of the constituents and components that affect public health, we're not, you know, until we're doing that, we're not going to be able to weigh the value of, you know, a short duration smoke event from a prescribed burn versus a long duration event from an out of control wildfire. So, and I just want to give the shout out to the Placer County Air District. They're an amazing partner. They've done a ton of research, really, which I think is now kind of the state of the art research as to the emissions differences between leaving the material in the woods, either in a pile to decompose or to pile burn, versus wildfire emissions, versus the impact of, for example, biomass when you're putting that material into a controlled burn situation with scrubbers and technology. So that's another way that the air districts are helping, is giving us that basis to make the case.
Kerri brings up some good points on carbon and the future of carbon and trying to reach some sort of a stable state. And one of the projects our company is working on is trying to avoid the catastrophic wildfire emissions through, once again, proactive treatments, understanding we will have to reduce some carbon in the short term, but the long-term goal and benefits are a more stable, carbon stable forest that's not going to burn as intensely. We won't lose it all at once. And so how do you incentivize that and taking those proactive steps to reduce the carbon from, the buildup that we have right now to a more resilient, stable state? How do you incentivize that? How do you get, Janet brought up Blue Coalition, impact investing, conservation finance. There's so many people that enjoy healthy, resilient forests. How do we leverage private sector funding to once again get behind these proactive treatments when they don't necessarily own the land? Big challenges. My hat's off to folks like Janet that are able to find, and you and all folks that are able to find grant monies and funding, but a lot of that is soft funding. We need to look at longer term solutions, I think.
And tied to that are longer term solutions for maintaining the initial investment. And that's probably a whole other workshop, but we put so much energy into getting these initial treatments on the ground, and everybody goes, okay, great, 6,000 acres done, check, forever. Well, 10 or 15 years from now, vegetation grows back and here we are again. So instead of the series of kind of first entry type projects, we need to somehow find a way to get people to accept the need to maintain these projects over time as well.
That's a great point. We are just about out of time. So I'd like to quickly say thank you to our attendees, and thank you so much to all of you panelists for joining us today and engaging in this discussion. We'll be sending out follow-up materials to all registrants, so be on the lookout. That includes a recording, slides, and some other funding opportunity news to help you with your planning efforts. So, and if you would like to provide comments or feedback to myself or the SPC Sierra Camp team, you can contact the emails that have just been dropped in the chat box. So thank you all again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day and week. So take care.
Thank you, James.